Welcome to episode 2 of the Wyke Poltergeist. If you've not already listened to the first episode, go do that now. You don't want to start here. This will also be the final episode for Wyke, an unusual 2-episode series. I think it's just the way it will go sometimes. I start these series having done minimal research, but I don't know whether it's going to end up being a 6-parter or, in this case, a 2-parter. It's all part of the fun, I'm afraid. I'm Stephen Miller, and this is Series 5 of the Poltergeist Project, my historical podcast series. So, Wyke, a quick recap. Basically, over a weekend in June 1909, a home in Wyke, West Yorkshire, was terrorised by loud knocks and furniture moving. There were multiple credible witnesses and some really odd physical phenomena. Items weren't just toppling over or falling off things or even flying across the room in a way that they could have been thrown. They were seen to dance and jump with an agency that would seem to be impossible. It was big news at the time, making headlines across the country. But all in all, it was probably only a few hours of activity. Since the first episode, I've been working on 3 different strands of research that I'm going to share with you in this episode. First, who were the family? And who were some of the visitors they had in relation to these events. Second, some context and background on Wyke, especially its paranormal history. And finally, the case was also part of the Society for Psychical Research archive that I visited recently in Cambridge, so I'll talk about what was in that folder as well. I'll end with some theories for possible explanations, and reveal where we're going to be going for Series 6 of the Poltergeist Project, so stick around for that. Now, thankfully for my research into the family, Mrs. Priestley was still living at number 6 Church Street on the night of the 1911 census. This makes my life an awful lot easier. Her name was Jane Priestley, and she was 79 at the time of our case, not 82, as was reported in the press. Her husband, Robert, had died in 1897, so she'd been a widow for over 10 years at the time of our case. They'd had 4 daughters together, Ada, Naomi, Emma, and Florence. Mrs. Priestley died herself in 1915. Her brother-in-law, Seth Butler, our hero, was born on the 30th of October 1830, so close to a Halloween birthday for our ghost hunter. The local gossip and initial newspaper reports at the time brought an awful lot of attention to the house. Literally hundreds of people gathered outside. Amongst them were a few interesting visitors. One of these was the local vicar, Reverend Howell. Now, he didn't witness any phenomena himself, but he was fairly open-minded and very puzzled by what the family had told him. This is a direct quote from Reverend Howell. Had it only been a few women who had seen them and become a little hysterical, one might have doubted it, but then men like Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones, and Mr. Brayshaw all saw these things, and they are all shrewd, sensible men who are not likely to be deceived and whom one must believe. Oh dear, a bit of classic sexism there for you. Had it been just the women who witnessed this, we could have dismissed this poltergeist activity, but sensible men saw what was going on. Surely there's something odd here. I guess, we're talking well over 100 years ago, a product of his time. Another, more mysterious visitor was an unnamed German man who said to a reporter in broken English that, "I was asked to come. I laughed yesterday, but now I believe it is a reality. I have told the old lady to sit in the house alone, and when the spirits come, now I'm not a spiritualist, but I've told her to ask the spirits what she can do for it. We are all Christians," I said, "and if she prays, these ghosts will cease coming." Who on earth was this guy? There's no further details about him. I have nothing other to go off other than he was a German man. Who would have asked him to come? It's very strange. He goes on talking about cases back in Germany and a book from Leipzig that had a similar case. It's clearly, in the world of the paranormal. But yeah, I don't know how he ended up turning up to this house in Wyke. 2 other visitors of interest were Mr. and Mrs. Birchall. Now, the newspaper says these were well known as leading lights in the spiritualist cult of Bradford. Mrs. Birchall said that although they called upon Mrs. Priestley and explained their mission, they'd not been able to see her. They were informed that she was indisposed. Sounds like she just wasn't interested in talking to them. They believed that the phenomena was being caused by a spirit or spirits trying to communicate. And they recommended calling in a medium, and that would be a sensible course of action for the family. Mrs. Birchall claimed that while she was in the house, she saw two shadowy figures known as Bill and Betsy, or that's what they were known as in life. When she mentioned this to the Priestley family, they said that she was a wonderful guesser. The Priestleys wouldn't let them hold a séance in the property. Now let me cover some of Wyke's background history. Like much of West Yorkshire at the time, Wyke was pretty heavily industrialised. It had a long history of mining, quarrying and metalwork. It also had a rich paranormal history, surprisingly rich given its small size. I mentioned the Headless Horseman, Bevis Bar Ted, in the last episode, and we know that our hero Seth Butler had encountered the Biley Boggart, not the Beely Boggart, as I said last time. Apparently I was pronouncing that wrong. Thanks, Paul. The Boggart apparently had haunted the local community for over 30 years. But there's more. Local historian Kai Roberts, whose book I've got next to me here on Haunted Huddersfield, he wrote a brilliant blog post all about Wyke and its paranormal history. Now, sadly, Kai Roberts passed away a few years ago now. He was a brilliant local historian and died tragically young. It was a real shame. But his blog post all about Wyke covers all sorts of paranormal activity, poltergeists and ghosts, but we also have earthlights and UFOs, phantom vehicles. When I posted about the first episode of this series on a local Wyke Facebook group, I received loads of messages from people who'd witnessed strange goings-on, not just in the village, but specifically on and near the site of 6 Church Street. Now, today that area has been developed into a modern estate. It was developed in the 1960s and 70s. A repeated apparition was that of a small boy, a young boy, dressed in mining clothing. Now, there's no apparitions associated with the 1909 case, so maybe totally unrelated, but it's interesting that the area is still a bit of a paranormal hotspot. It's a few weeks now since I visited the SPR archives in Cambridge. That's why this episode has taken me a little while to get out. I've been pretty busy going through and releasing a few special episodes about that archive. And the case file on Wyke, file P51 in the Poltergeist collection, was very thin. Disappointingly thin, really, to be honest. But you never know when you go into an archive and you call up a document exactly what's going to be in there. Now, this one contained just 2 letters from friend of the podcast, John Arthur Hill. In both letters, he's replying to 2 different women who had sent him newspaper cuttings about what was going on at the house in Wyke. Here is one of his replies. The other one is very similar. Dear Miss Newton, thanks for your letter and newspaper cutting. I had already interested myself in the Wyke Poltergeist and should have duly informed you if the evidence seemed worth getting up. I've not been able to visit the people myself, but it happened that the Congregationalist minister at Wyke is an old acquaintance of ours, chiefly of my deceased father's, and I wrote asking him if there was anything genuine about the newspaper reports. He immediately went to the house and interviewed Mrs. Priestley, who, as well as one of her daughters, is a member of his congregation. He was informed that there was a good deal of exaggeration in the newspaper reports, but that certainly things had happened which were difficult to explain. He has known the family for nearly 40 years and has absolute confidence in Mrs. Priestley's integrity, but is inclined to explain the phenomena by hysteria and hallucination. The old lady, Mrs. Priestley, is suffering from the infirmities of old age, and one of the daughters is ill with a spinal complaint. Perhaps one of them has been doing the poltering. Anyhow, from what my clerical friend tells me, it does not seem worthwhile to get detailed statements. Mrs. and Miss Priestley are the chief eyewitnesses of the actual movements. I think these 2, for the reasons just mentioned, are probably not reliable, particularly as they are uneducated people of the usual cottage type, without any notion of the accuracy required in scientific matters. In short, my opinion is that though there may have been some supernatural agency at work, and some few of the statements are difficult to account for otherwise, there seems nonetheless no probability that working up the case would yield evidence worth submitting to the Society, DSBR. If, however, there's any further outbreak of the phenomena, and if good evidence is obtainable, I will write you again. At present, the spooks seem to have subsided into quiescence. I am yours faithfully, J. Arthur Hill. Maybe John Arthur Hill's not going to be a friend of the podcast anymore. I really don't like his snobbish tone and comments about the family being uneducated cottage types, and therefore the evidence was of less value. Also, the talk of, Mrs. Priestley being of excellent character, but a woman, and therefore unreliable. And now, unfortunately, this view, would have been pretty common at the time. The principal witnesses being women, although there were others, was problematic for some people, as we've already seen from the local vicar. I don't like this assertion about the quality of the witnesses, and he was wrong in that there was more than just Miss Priestley and her daughter. I am slightly inclined to agree with him in general. There is limited evidence, but what we do have is very difficult to explain. Now, there were some attempts to rationalise this at the time. As a sceptic, I am naturally drawn to try and find a sceptical explanation for this seemingly inexplicable phenomena. A group of reporters who were gathered outside the house shouted to Mrs. Priestley, "Are you a medium?" To which she replied, "No, I've never been a medium, but nobody has been able to tell us how this is happening. What do you think?" Now, one theory going around at the time was pretty boring: subsidence. The idea was that all the mining in the area had caused the house to shift and to drop, and this had then made things fall inside the house and move. Now, Mrs. Priestley was adamant that her house had never been mined under. But, realistically, she probably wouldn't know that. They'd been mining in that area for hundreds and hundreds of years, so there could have been a really old working beneath her house that could have collapsed. Even if that was the case, and there was a working, hundreds of feet below the home, an old prop had dropped, leading to a shift in the earth. Even with a bit of imagination, I don't see how subsidence can cause some of the phenomena that was witnessed. It just doesn't add up. Also, why would it just be this house, and just for this very specific time period? Sorry, Team Skeptic. For me, this one doesn't do it. Another theory that was very popular was around electricity. I think some of this is electricity was still relatively novel. There were electric trams being powered by overhead cables nearby, and electricity was becoming more normal within people's homes. But looking at it now, I just don't see how even poor electronics and faulty connections and things could be the cause of a cushion repeatedly flying into the face of Mrs. Priestley. I understand at the time electricity seemed pretty magical and mysterious and made things happen that seemed kind of impossible. But looking back on it now, I don't see that as a reasonable, sceptical explanation either. A final theory, and the one, if I was going to pick one I would favour, is one that we always have to look at in poltergeist cases, and that is foul play. It was talked about in the local press, but largely dismissed, actually. It was thought that the house and the rooms were too small, and there were too many witnesses, and some of the incidents had happened in broad daylight in front of multiple people. Now, I personally wouldn't be so quick to dismiss it entirely. I could see how some of the things may have been the work of Mrs. Priestley's daughters or granddaughters messing around. I do think it seems unlikely, and I will concede that it would have been incredibly difficult for them to have faked it all in the way it was described in the press. So where does that leave us? I think, a bit like John Arthur Hill said, because the phenomena was so short-lived, it will remain a mystery. maybe Wyke is a paranormal hotspot, or maybe heavy industry has created a specific set of environmental conditions that make extraordinary things happen. What do you think? It's an odd little story, and I'm glad we covered it, even though it's only been a couple of episodes, and it turned out perhaps there wasn't a huge amount of other activity going on. Well, what next for me and the Poltergeist project? Well, the next episode I release will be my collaboration with the Beyond the Veil guys and their podcast, so keep an eye out for that one. It's a pretty long-form interview about some of the series so far, and just a general chat about the paranormal and poltergeists specifically. Lee and Brett, great guys. I'd recommend their podcast as well. Go and check out their back catalogue. There's some really good content in there. After that, and I'm already starting the research for Series 6. Drumroll, Series 6 will be the Nettlebed Poltergeist. Now, Nettlebed is somewhere I had never heard of before I started digging into this, but it's a small village in Oxfordshire, in the Chilterns, about 40 miles west of London. Now, this case is directly from the SPR archive. It's never been researched before or made public that I know of. It didn't appear in the press at the time, and as far as I know, has been hidden away in the SPR archives for over 100 years. Now, it's also, by far, I think, the darkest and scariest poltergeist case I'll have covered. It's genuinely quite disturbing in places, I'm afraid, with some tragic aspects, which, of course, I'll deal with sensitively. There'll be lots of trigger warnings, so people can avoid it if it's going to be difficult for them to listen to, which I totally understand. But I do think historically it is interesting and unusual enough to make it a valid, piece of work to do. It also has a really weird connection to the creator of James Bond and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Ian Fleming. In fact, I'm not sure of this yet, but I think he may have witnessed some of the phenomena. Don't know whether it played into any of his James Bond stories. I don't remember James Bond having much to do with ghosts, but who knows? For sure, you won't want to miss this one. Now, thanks as always for listening, and goodbye for now.